I'm honored to present James Purnell, President and Vice Chancellor of University of the Arts London, who will open this event with some welcoming words.
Hello, everybody. I actually couldn't hear you just then, so I hope you can all hear me. I'm sure Tom will come in and tell me if I'm not audible. Good, I assume that I am. Welcome, everybody. It's an absolute joy to be here at this Unbauhaus event. I don't know if it's Unbauhaus or Unbauhaus, but I'm sure you'll work that out during the day. Thank you to everybody who's organised today. These things never happen simply. They're always a lot of work. So thank you very much for making this important event possible. Walter Gropius once said that architecture started when engineering ended. And it reminded me of one of Jeremy Till's maxims, I think quoting Peter Guthrie, that architecture is but waste in transit. So got Gropius saying that architecture starts where engineering ends, quite a confident statement, and maybe a more humble one, that architecture is waste in transit. I'd have loved to hear the two of them battle it out. I imagine Jeremy would have had a pretty good chance of winning, but in the absence of that possibility, today's event is the very best next thing that we could hope for. It's a chance to grapple with the inheritance of the Bauhaus, the optimism, but also the complications of modernism and the modern project and how that feels nearly 100 years on, and to think about the similarities. I mean, you know, like Bauhaus, we are a university that tries to bring together many different creative disciplines to be more than the sum of the parts. Like Gropius, we have a social project or set of social projects, but it's also absolutely vital that in approaching those, we do so in a way that isn't simplistic or uncritical. And I read your program today as trying to nudge us towards understanding what the complexity of those ideas is and how they've changed 100 years on. I'm sure it will be a useful and valuable set of perspectives on the European Commission's project, but I think maybe selfishly for us at UAL, I'm sure it's going to be absolutely vital input into thinking through what we want to do as we come out of COVID and hopefully start to return to something a bit more like our normal lives. Because UAL, being a place committed to social purpose, needs to think through those ideas in a complex, thoughtful, rounded way. And looking at your titles today, it feels to me that when you're talking about going beyond beauty, when you're thinking about how we hardwire in inclusion, I'm taking that as you may be nudging us to think how we avoid creativity being instrumentalized in that attempt to achieve social change through our creativity, through our practices, through our ideas, which I absolutely believe in. But an event like today, I think is going to be vital for making sure that we do so in an inclusive, sophisticated, thoughtful way. So thank you very much to the organizers for making today possible. Good luck to the presenters, both in terms of technical challenges these events prove, but with everything else involved in presenting today. And I look forward hugely to hearing what you discussed and the insight that it can offer to UAL, but also to the world more generally, as we start to think about how we can create a better society after the difficulties of the last year.
Thank you, James, for those inspiring words as we are at this transition together. My name is Ramia Mazé. I'm Professor of Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability here at University of the Arts London, which is UAL in full. It's my pleasure to welcome on behalf of the organizers of this event, all of you in the audience and all of you who are presenting and contributing in various forms today. The organizers today include Lucy Kimball, Professor and Director of UAL's Social Design Institute, Susan Puisan-Locke, Professor and Director of UAL's Decolonizing Arts Institute, Ben Stopher, Dean of UAL's Creative Computing Institute, CCI, Mick Grierson, Professor and Research Leader at CCI, And we've had inputs from various perspectives in the development of this event, including from the professoriate at UAL. This event is a collaboration with UAL's International Relations Unit and Research Management and Administration. Contacts for further information is in the chat. Event production is thanks to CCI's Tom Lynch, Georgiana Capdevila Cano, and Matt Jarvis. Graphics are by Connor Rigby. Thank you especially to our project coordinator, Yoki Adejumo. And you get the sense from this collective introduction that we are here together in a collective moment, as James, you noted for UAL, but also in relation to the larger societal transition and the societal ambitions of the European Commission's new Bauhaus initiative. This event on Bauhaus aims to catalyze creative responses and challenges to the European Commission's new European Bauhaus, which was announced in late 2020 by the EC. With the aim to shape the future of Europe, not a small aim in this postmodern age, the new European Bauhaus is formulated as in terms of three values: beautiful, sustainable, and inclusive. Remember those key words, we'll come back to them. And as a creative and interdisciplinary movement in the making. The new European Bauhaus was launched as a process with a co-design phase, inviting inputs to shape this emerging agenda and potentially other agendas, including the Green New Deal. Within this phase, a number of institutions have published standpoints or organized events in response. And the title of our event, Unbauhaus, as James, you noticed, is a play on words, a bit of a pun, un jeu de mots, if I use my French citizenship and the language of our European colleagues, some of them. The original Bauhaus was a pioneering school that became an archetype for others, un Bauhaus, among perhaps others to follow. And we speak from another creative university here and today. On Bauhaus is our first response from UAL. There may be more. It's a collective and a multivocal response, resonant with our commitment to social and climate justice at UAL. As you heard from James, this is an institutional commitment with various manifestations, including within and with our long-standing partners across Europe and indeed in all continents. The un in Unbauhaus also signals how we have framed the event today as an event that unpacks or unfolds the express values of the new European Bauhaus initiative. Again, beautiful, inclusive, sustainable. Those words are ideals and aspirations. That's the intent. But they're also ideas, core concepts debated and developed within a history of ideas in the humanities and within our cultural and creative disciplines, those at the heart of this university and others. As ideas, we resist reducing these to buzzwords or too quickly solutionizing these. As ideas, these can also be lenses, critical and constructive lenses, through which to situate and position ourselves self-critically, self-consciously, and ambitiously today. To position ourselves in relation to one another, within history, and towards the future. We need this context, this history of ideas, this critical as well as constructive context, in order to discern the new, as in the new European Bauhaus. And of course, we don't want just any old new. We want to be able to discern and direct towards a desired future, not just any new, a desired future. To this point, let's be creative, let's be concrete. And let's take the example of sustainability, my subject area, and not least in the foreground with COP26 hosted by the UK in autumn. We know that sustainability must not become a greenwash buzzword. Sustainability is a complex topic crossing many disciplines and sectors in societies. It must be addressed comprehensively beyond our national, European, or continental boundaries. We need to be transnational about this. Sustainability is also a matter of intergenerational justice. I think of our students, of international, racial, class, and gender justice. There are indeed colonial histories behind the resources that have built our societies, our institutions, and indeed that underpin our creative, among other industries. Sustainability isn't ideal as put forward in this tripartite set of values in the new European Bauhaus, but it's also an idea, a complex idea, characterized by dynamic forces and fissures that cross boundaries, that are deeply embedded and long lasting. How do we even imagine, much less get to a new from our current situation? We need to understand these concepts critically and also creatively. A commitment to social and climate justice requires dismantling and reimagining the old, the current, as well as the new. And that's what we'll be doing today at the Unbauhaus. Unpacking, unfolding these ideals, these ideas put forward within the new European Bauhaus, and we'll be exploring these tripartite notions: beautiful, sustainable, and inclusive. We'll shift focus to their fissures and to possible alternative futures. This is a 3-hour event structured as a series of quite a few short talks responding to these 3 themes through 3 questions. Beyond beauty, a question of imagining beyond existing canons and regimes of taste, which will be introduced in more depth by Professor Susan Puisan-Locke in a few minutes. After that, more than sustainability in the context of climate emergency, introduced by Professor Malcom Quinn. Matters of inclusion, sensory, creative, and diverse engagements, introduced by Ben Stopher. Our speakers today, which you can see named on screen, are creative practitioners and academics from UAL across a wide range of fields and perspectives. And we recognize particularly the intersectionality of our positions and our identities. While many of the co-design responses to the new European Bauhauses have concentrated on spatial, often architectural interventions or responses, we crucially here integrate further lenses, including art, design, technology, media, sound, fashion, film, and you will discover more as we explore today together. These, as well as the creative processes, systems, actions, and ways of thinking, our disciplines, the outputs, the forms, and the processes are things we have to offer. UAL is a contemporary creative university, encompasses myriad creative disciplines that crucially offer embodied material, experimental strategy for engaging with societal challenges in unexpected way, beyond the old and the current, really rethinking the new. Critical and creative lenses for making the invisible visible, the inaudible heard, and enabling different ways of seeing, listening, thinking, and making. You will find today's agenda, which you saw briefly on screen, also in the event description below in your YouTube window. The series of short talks divided into 3 themes will be followed by a moderated roundtable discussion with external guests that also bring additional standpoints, including those of students and the cultural sector. Before we dive in, a couple of practical notes to guide the interactive parts of today's discussion. Please be aware that this is a public event that's being recorded and it will be uploaded afterwards on this YouTube channel. The archived version will also have closed captioning so that you can read along with listening and seeing on screen the content here. You can also see the social media hashtags for the event, which we encourage you to use if and as you wish. We'd like to encourage everyone who attends and who is comfortable to do so to engage in the chat function on the YouTube window. You find this at the right side of your screen if you're joining from a laptop, or below the video if you're joining from a mobile or tablet device. The chat will also be part of the public documentation of the event, and we welcome feedback, input, perspectives. For the chat, we're committed to a safe space for people to share and give feedback with respect. That's why we put together a series of discussion guidelines for participating in the chat. You can find this in the event description and in the chat itself. With these words of orientation and welcome, we look forward on behalf of the organizers to exploring with you, to sharing with you, to uncovering in this Unbauhaus with you a series of perspectives, standpoints, and creative responses to these Unbauhaus themes today. With that, I will hand it over to the first session in today's event and to the introducer of Beyond Beauty, Professor Susan Puy-Sandlock.
Thank you very much to James and Ramia for the generous and careful introductions and very welcome orientations. And thanks to all the speakers participating today for what I'm sure will prove a rich and complex range of interdisciplinary and critical insights, suggestive of the ways in which UAL and the creative arts and design can contribute to social change and the new Bauhaus, new European Bauhaus project. As Ramia said, my name is Susan Puy-Sandlock, and I'm an artist, writer, researcher, professor in contemporary art, and director of the UAL Decolonizing Arts Institute. It is an honor and pleasure to introduce the speakers in our first panel, who will each be offering short provocations in response to the thematic proposition Beyond Beauty. How can we imagine and create objects, practices, structures, and places beyond existing canons and regimes of taste to acknowledge and address exclusions, absences, and silences? My role is quite simply to introduce the speakers, who are Dr. Adriana Cobo, Dr. Dave Beech, Dr. Annie Wan, Professor Pratāp Rughani, and Dr. Maitrayee Basu. Before we begin, allow me to further dwell on the deliberately unsettling prefix that we have playfully, provocatively, and perhaps for some controversially introduced in front of the term Bauhaus, and also on the multivalent potential of the term beyond, at once preposition, adverb, and noun. Is a prefix meaning not, which may usually be taken to signal a negative or opposite force: unfair, unfelt, unseen, unformed, unrest, or a reversal of some action or state, a removal, deprivation, or release, undo, uncover. I'd like to suggest that to unbow, to unbuild, to dismantle may not necessarily constitute a negative or oppositional move or compulsion, not a destructive but a deconstructive impulse, not necessarily a reversal as such, but rather a going back over, a revisiting, reviewing, to unpack, as Ramia said, to question the potential past and future inequities and exclusions in the ideologies, relations, narratives, and practices on which the new European Bauhaus initiative is founded. Is a reminder that we may need to uncover and unfold, to recover, to admit and attend to past and future inequities in order to envision, revision, and realize the so-called beautiful, sustainable, and inclusive in our futures. Is a reminder to attend to the unfair, the unfelt, the unseen, the unformed, to uncover, unfold, and undo in order to build anew. And beyond. Beyond may take us away from conventional, conservative, Western European, patriarchal, heteronormative, white-centric, and ableist constructions of beauty. Beyond may bring us to other sites and constructs, not after, but perhaps concurrent, and indeed before, in non-linear relation, always already here and elsewhere. Beyond may signify conceptual and philosophical ideas and perspectives that are unfamiliar, unknown, or as yet untranslated into the dominant cultural discourses of the West. Onto our panel. Within this theme, our speakers come from different forms of creative practice and traditions of critical thinking: architecture, visual arts, filmmaking, digital arts, creative computation, and media and communication studies. They will share different perspectives on what is beautiful, that is, what is considered beautiful is not obvious or agreed upon, but culturally, historically, and geographically located, within which some views and voices have been centered, while others have been marginalized or excluded. And how beauty is being reimagined and reformed in the arts, culture, technologies, and media. You will hear how the notion of beauty can be a barrier to considering sustainability and inclusion within urban design. You will hear how histories, theories, and institutions of beauty conceal prejudice behind a screen of universality and neutrality. You will hear how digital technologies can change and enhance our understandings of beauty. You will hear a call to imagine new ways of listening, new ways of speaking and telling stories to restore communities fractured by polarization. You will hear how digital protests raise important questions about freedom, intimacy, and belonging. You will hear about the potential for digital technologies to make the world more beautiful through creative expression, discovery, connection, playfulness, and inclusivity. Together, these contributions will invite us to rethink our individual and collective assumptions, to go beyond, before, and between Western Eurocentric dominant versions of beauty, where beauty is a continual site of struggle, resistance, and transformation. And while the beautiful may in some sense be synonymous with the fair, beauty may also conceal unfairness. So now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Adriana Cobo. Adriana works on critical performance projects tailored to specific urban sites. Her research examines the codes and practices of contemporary public space, including taste and architectural design. To outline her provocation regarding architectural practice, Adriana believes that ideals of beauty get in the way of achieving inclusive and sustainable urban futures, advocating for a suspension of the role of architects as makers of taste and/or beauty, to allow instead open understandings of taste as a precarious set of collective and contingent constructions.
Hello, my name is Adriana Cobo, and I am here today to talk about beauty from the field of architecture and urban design. My proposition is that beauty gets on the way of sustainability and inclusion in design. Why? From my experience training as an architect, researching and teaching architecture, I have seen that traditionally architecture has been taught and practiced as a profession dedicated to producing exclusive spaces for exclusive clients with exclusive tastes and notions of what beauty should look like. And this practice, in my view, has been an agent of exclusion. And today, this is not sustainable. Why? Because this is a practice that requires cleaning or the need of a tabula rasa to initiate original innovative design, rather than what I would propose as a focused attention of what is there, what exists already, that we should take care of and maintain and build up new knowledge and new design from. So how to do this? Well, I propose a focus on use and to place and engage with citizens, the ways they inhabit buildings and cities and their situated knowledges and their situated tastes and notions of beauty at the center of design. So we can understand taste and beauty as collective constructions, whereby the voices of those who are at the heart of human-centered design are not overshadowed by the more overpowering and traditionally dominant figure of the architect or designer, who conceive of himself as a taste maker or a man of taste. So that way, I believe, when design practices are increasingly interested in socially engaged design, taste can be elaborated further and along with the social shift in spatial practices, rather than to keep it as a taboo subject almost that lags behind this social shift. So I propose to understand taste beyond style and taste beyond form, and I propose that designers conceive of ourselves beyond taste making, and so that our skills, our designerly skills, the ability to foresee and imagine desirable futures, relies on our capacity to use drawing, modeling, etc., in ways other than only making visually compelling objects. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Dr. Dave Beech, who is a reader in art and Marxism at UAL-CCW, that's Chelsea, Camberwell and Wimbledon colleges. Dave is an artist who was a member of the Free Art Collective, making photo-based text works such as Protest is Beautiful. He is also a writer with books that include The Philistine Controversy with John Roberts, Beauty, published by Whitechapel and MIT Press, Art and Value, published by Brill, and Art and Labour, published by Haymarket. In his presentation, Dave will outline a critical survey of the politics of beauty in art, in modernism, postmodernism, and contemporary culture, highlighting how the beautiful has been a constant site of struggle. He navigates through the controversies of beauty, guided by those social movements that have revealed time and time again that the histories, theories, and institutions of beauty conceal prejudice behind a screen of universality and neutrality.
As a student in the early 90s, I visited an exhibition by a young artist in a commercial gallery in London and was asked by the dealer what I thought about the paintings. Always intimidated by the gatekeepers of art, I said nervously that the paintings were ironic, funny, clever, subversive, that sort of thing. The dealer interrupted to correct me, saying the paintings were beautiful. I was stunned. My work as an artist, which has included video, performance, socially engaged projects, billboard posters, and currently consists of making prints from montages built out of second-hand books, has always taken sides with the love of monstrosity, the promise of ugliness, and the hopes of Philistinism against beauty. Beauty is an old-fashioned word. Sian and Guy is vital reading today because she reorients aesthetic theory around words like cute instead. However, part of the power of beauty derives from its absence from vernacular speech. Museums, for instance, continue to use the word beauty in their advertisements in art magazines, with phrases like eternal beauty, convulsive beauty, invisible beauty, and fragile beauty. What I try to do in my work is not simply to make ugly works, but to give images a completely different charge. The point is not to invert aesthetic value, or to oppose aesthetics altogether, but to make the aesthetic aspects of every work seem inappropriate to the subject or secondary to something else that's being done to the images. I reflect on two contradictory legacies of modernism in my montages. These images are organised visually around formalism, geometry and abstraction. However, the works also use found materials, chance, violence and mechanical reproducibility. The montages bridge the modernisation of beauty to a more critical counter-tendency of modernism that at its heart wanted to replace the aesthetic regime of beauty with an appreciation or love of the informal, the monstrous and the popular. Every political liberation movement has found its own reasons for objecting to the concept of beauty. Patrick Califia Rice, the trans activist and writer, said in his book Macho Sluts, "The things that seem beautiful, inspiring and life-affirming to me seem ugly, hateful and ludicrous to most other people." And Paul Gilroy acknowledged in his classic book The Black Atlantic that valuable work has already been done by Sander Gilman, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and others on the history and role of the figure of the black in different forms of the aesthetics of Hegel, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as a marker for moments of cultural relativism and to support the production of aesthetic judgments of a supposedly universal character to differentiate, for example, between authentic music and, as Hegel put it, the most detestable noise. This is why it was so important during the civil rights movement to declare that black is beautiful. And this is what fueled my argument in the introduction to my book on beauty, that aesthetic theory needs to embrace Paul Ricoeur's idea of hermeneutics of suspicion. Ricoeur argued that this was the common factor of Marx, Nietzsche and Freud. Marx looked at capitalism not chiefly as a system of producing wealth, but as a system for producing poverty, alienation, exploitation and misery. Nietzsche saw philosophy not principally as the search for truth, but as a masked ball for illusion, delusion, vanity and power. Freud saw the human subject not mainly as the agent of reason, but as the source of unconscious drives, desires, pathologies and delusions. I wanted to unsettle our inherited notion of beauty in a similar way, seeing it not only as something good, pleasant, ethical and affirmative, but also as constraining, repressive, intolerant, complicit and ideological. Let's say then that an aesthetics of suspicion is based on the principle that it is unacceptable to talk about beauty and taste and aesthetic judgment without giving a full account of the shadows they cast.
Our next speaker is Dr. Annie Wan. Annie is an international scholar in digital media and course leader for the BA Honours in Virtual Reality at UAL London College of Communication. She has 9 years of teaching experience across digital media, media technology and creative coding, along with 13 years of research experience across digital media and technology projects. She's currently project director and principal investigator of a project called ACIT. Annie's propagation will introduce her primary research interests in digital preservation and the adoption of extended reality technologies for social good.
Hi, this is Annie. I'm currently a BA virtual reality course leader, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad that I can join this event. And today I'm going to talk about a few projects that I was working on in relation to the topic addressing exclusions, absence, and silences. So first of all, I am going to talk about the project called Telepathy Machine. It's a project about the feelings being hurt and when you're facing this different kind of discrimination in everyday life, such as racial discrimination, sex discrimination, any kind of bullying at schools, for example. And this is about how we deal with and cope with that situation. And I picked virtual reality technology as a medium because I feel like the virtual reality is a way to represent scenario so people can feel or can experience how you feel at that particular situation. And I was also using brain computer interface in order to track people's brainwave and when they're thinking about that particular situation, that embarrassing situation. I also talked to friends around me and gathering their memories, their stories about discrimination, and recreate that scenario in VR.
It's okay like this. Tom, you can hear.
So another project I'm going to talk about is Imperfectionist. And that was the project I have done in 2002, last year. And yeah, it was like a century ago, right? And it was back to the beginning of the pandemic. And I also interviewed a number of friends and people around me, and they share with me about their feelings towards the pandemic. For example, they're feeling lonely, they're feeling sad because they are afraid of losing their jobs, and certain like many different kind of emotions around this pandemic situation. And I recreate different scenes based on their experience and invited performers to perform and capture the emotions so that I can map to the 3D characters in the VR scene. Its habits impact us emotion. So we did include a lot of professionals, psychologists, performers, video specialists. COVID-19 has changed our worlds upside down. Wearing masks and social distancing is the new normal. Feeling trapped in our own homes, how do these habits impact us emotionally? Funded by the Hong Kong West Kowloon Cultural District Authority and by including talents in the field of virtual reality, performing arts, digital video, music, and psychology. This project aims to explore the minds of people in these difficult times through a holistic and innovative view. Despite our vulnerabilities, we are all in this together. We can be powerful and we can triumph through the worst times. And now I'm not quite sure if we already passed the worst times. Anyways, another project I'm going to talk about is part of the ACID project. So ACID is a European funded project that I'm working on right now at UAL, and I'm the principal investigator as well as the project director. And the project aim is to help assist SMEs in London working in virtual reality, AR technology, or any kind of immersive technology projects. So we are helping one of the participants in the academic research. And this application is called My Finder. And this project utilizes a number of technologies such as AI, computer vision, and also AR technology in order to create an assistive application for the visual impaired. Continue. A number, like basically like everything in your living environment or in your everyday life environment could be recognized by the applications. And then you can tell you what exactly it is in order to avoid obstacles for the visual impaired, or it can also tell you the expiry date, for example, of a certain food. Umbrella. Double tap to exit. Exit under view button. The new result is text analysis. 305 the Westgate, Queen Street. Double tap to exit. Search button. Search. Ellipsis. Text field. Text field is editing. Search. Ellipsis. Dictate button. Double tap to start dictation. So thank you. This is all my presentation today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.
Our next provocation comes from Professor Pratāp Rughani. Pratāp is Professor of Documentary Practices, and he leads the research department of UAL London College of Communication. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker with over 30 film credits for Channel 4, BBC TV, the British Council, and fine art spaces, including Modern Art Oxford. He presents and writes widely on documentary practices and intercultural dialogue. Pratāp explores through his presentation how too much of our storytelling in public art, culture, and media is structured in opposition or as opposition, and how we urgently need to reimagine and invent better ways of modelling how to listen and speak, creating works that restore communities fractured by polarisation.
Hello, my name is Pratāp Rughani, documentary maker and head of research at the London College of Communication. In 4 minutes, I'm going to try and question why too much of our storytelling in public art, culture and media is structured in oppositional narratives that overwhelmingly privilege the heat of conflict rather than the light of understanding. But what if we were to rigorously privilege light rather than heat? In polarised times with huge environmental and social challenges, we urgently need to reimagine and invent better ways of modelling how to listen and talk to explore differences, producing art that navigates difference and countercurrents in both our individual and collective experience, what we might call restorative narrative, approaches that can draw us out from rabbit holes that incubate conflict. I explore this in a short paper on the UAL website called Design for Dialogue, Valuing Doubt in an Age of Conviction. Currently, social media metrics monetize division. How can the algorithms of injustice be changed to reward social connection, to restore rather than degrade our connective tissue? Can we imagine social media that works towards you not being triggered and privileges responses that de-escalate rather than polarize? What might that look or feel like? What kind of social media design, exhibitions, films, and experiences might this make? If you think this is easy work, then have a look for a moment at a favourite view on either side of Brexit or Trump, for example, or current race debates, or a serious family division, and think about how you would communicate to the other side. What would create the conditions for each to hear the other? I've been very fortunate in my own work to have witnessed the struggle to understand opposition and the aftermath of conflict, including in extreme environments, when coming to terms, for example, with atrocity. I'm thinking of work with Desmond Tutu and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example. But more recently, I moderated a meeting between a mum, Joan Scourfield, and a young man, Jacob Dunn, who killed her son. Joan Scourfield's son, James, was a young paramedic killed in 2011 from a single punch to his head. Jacob pleaded guilty to this random, unprovoked attack and eventually served 13 months in prison for manslaughter. Later, James's mother, Joan Scourfield, met Jacob through restorative justice charity Remedy. And though Joan's son was killed by Jacob, she had moved beyond demonising him. Her main motive was to seek answers, to understand what had happened, and to come to terms with the family's overwhelming grief. Jacob's remorse and his own parallel and unexpected sense of loss eventually led Joan to help to encourage Jacob to rebuild his life and go back to studies. And what struck me was the quality of attention between the people in the room where I hosted this conversation. Joan and Jacob led an exchange that created a space to pause in a place where a new kind of geography of compassion started to emerge. A palpable sense of witnessing developed as this dialogue between people still seeking to see past the chronic pain of their suffering, but yet finding a way to communicate an understanding across the borders of self and other, victim and perpetrator. There is an alchemy in restorative justice and in restorative approaches that create a space to fully hear each other's words, sounds and silences, like rests in a musical score. It's here that documentary practices can combine with restorative justice methods to create restorative narrative, led by contributors' connections and stepping away from framing them in polarizing or oppositional approaches that are the endless instinct that have dominated so much mainstream narrative for far too long. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Maitrayee Basu, lecturer in Communications and Media Programme at UAL London College of Communication. Maitrayee's research is in the field of political intimacies, affects and identities on social media. Her recent articles have been published in journals including Feminist Media Theory and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. Her most recent work critically explores and expands the current methods of scholarship on digital protests and publics. Maitrayee's presentation questions, and I quote, when one's Muslimness could bring trouble into secular spaces, and how we should look more closely into the way these spaces are affectively constructed.
Hello, my name is Dr. Maitrayee Basu and I am a lecturer at London College of Communication in the Communication and Media Department. My research looks at political intimacies and identities on social media. Recently, I became very interested in the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests, which began in India in December 2019 and continued until March 2020. And while I was writing about this topic, I was asked to contribute to a special issue in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. I had never examined my topic through the lens of religion or religious identities and expressions, and my discomfort at being asked to do so intrigued me. So I decided to research and write about this resistance that I felt within secular democratic public discourses and spaces against engaging with the popular appeal and functions of religious slogans and aesthetic. Recently, India has seen a rapid rise of communal and sectarian violence against its Muslim population. Not only does this make it difficult for Muslims to take part in meaningful public discourse, but recent attempts to criminalize interreligious marriages means that these issues intersect also with issues that have been regarded as private, like women's right to marry or wear clothing of their choice. Moreover, far from normalizing such relationships, contemporary media texts like advertisements from nationally renowned brands like Tanishq from the Tata Group and Surf Excel depicting Friendships and filial ties between Hindus and Muslims have been recently boycotted and removed from circulation within India. I suggest that the recent increase in the visibility of Muslim women leading mass protests against a Hindu majoritarian government, like we saw in the anti-CAA protest, shatters this false dichotomy between public and private that has been propped up by a studied ignoration and exclusion of these bodies' lives, experiences, connectivities, and issues from the political discourses around equality and democracy. Hiba Baig, who's a columnist for the media platform The Quint, said recently that Muslims are not going to give up the kalima in order to become citizens. Aisha Rana, who is a hijabi student protester from Jamia Millia University in New Delhi, who became one of the faces of the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests, also raised this issue in a panel discussion recently. She says, hijab to kalima are demonized by the well-mannered liberal secularist in India. She says that my Muslimness could bring trouble into secular spaces. I explored the question, what does the marginalization of religious identification mean in the context of anti-authoritarian protests today? When I think back to my earliest introduction to the concepts of secularism and democracy in India, I'm reminded of the early 1990s civics lessons I received in Indian schools that painted a harmonious picture of religious, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. This diversity was celebrated through ritualistic means of school holidays, on major festivals, stories of multi-religious neighborhoods celebrating these occasions together, and a requirement to learn about official state languages and dress customs across the nation. Additionally, our curriculum provided us with a thorough grounding on the life histories and political philosophies of our nation's freedom fighters and their efforts to oppose division along communal lines within the Constitution and the national imaginary. Read alongside the historical context of communal riots and massacres that accompanied the births of India and Pakistan as sovereign nations from under colonial rule, my understanding of Indian democracy maintains at its centre a clear division within the celebration of religious identities in private and social spheres and exclusion of those religions from public and political spheres. The Indian state within this imaginary is optimistic and inclusive and tolerant with a clear protectionist intent. Reservations for women and ethnic and religious minorities within public sector jobs, as well as elected positions in local and central governments, has certainly projected the ideal that problems arising from social differences can be resolved by assimilation in the public sphere. As long as equality before law and participation within public sector offices can be maintained, differences of sex, religion, caste, and so on can continue to be practiced and expressed within private and domestic spheres. News and personal stories of people ostracized by communities for marrying outside their caste and religion, for example, my parents, the practice of untouchability under various guises within domestic spaces, and asking about one's religious background in conversations that happen quite casually in various social interactions, as well as professional interactions, did little to threaten the ideal of India's secular democracy in my mind, as well as many of people from my social caste and class. These secular discursive spaces have thus been propped up by a narrative sidelining of pain, suffering, and marginalization due to religious, caste, and sexual difference, and have prevented these side narratives from developing into political claims. I argue that these narratives are important to engage with and revive in order to form a truly inclusive, agnostic public.
The final provocation in this panel comes from Dr. Rebecca Fiebrink, who is a reader in the UAL Creative Computing Institute. Within the Institute, Rebecca designs new ways for people to use computers in creative practice. She has developed many open source software tools for creative machine learning, which are used by creative professionals and in teaching worldwide. Rebecca reflects that in 15 years of working with creators, no one has ever told her they want technology to help them make things that are more beautiful. Instead, her research into what creators do want reveals the importance of expression, discovery, exploration, embodied connection, playfulness, and inclusivity.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rebecca Fiebrink. I'm a computer scientist and I'm a reader at UAL's Creative Computing Institute. My research involves building new technologies for creative practitioners in music, design, and the arts. Much of my work explores how machine learning and AI can support human creative activities and expand people's creative possibilities. I've created open source software with tens of thousands of users around the world. It's been used to make new musical instruments, games, interactive artworks, and other immersive and interactive experiences, including the things you see on screen. I work closely with creators in many domains to understand what it is that they want from new technology. What do they want to do in their work that they haven't been able to do before? The answers are varied. Creative self-expression is unsurprisingly a priority. But for some people, when it comes to the roles that AI can play in transforming artistic practice, there's an exciting recognition that self-expression isn't necessarily just about dictating one's own brilliant vision and having it realized perfectly in technology. Rather, technology can help creators discover new creative possibilities they might not have thought of and explore rich design spaces that were previously off limits. One of my longtime collaborators is the composer and instrument builder Letitia Tsunami. She said about her work that in a way you don't want the instrument to perform like a well-trained animal circus. You kind of want it to be a little wild and you want to adapt to it somehow, like riding a bull. Supporting embodied connection is another important theme. We increasingly navigate our digital worlds using only our eyeballs and fingertips. Yet human experience is made up of senses, skills, cognition, and culture that all rely on other parts of ourselves. Many creators I work with, even people making purely digital work, desire new ways to engage their bodies in the processes of creative expression and exploration. Likewise, connecting to other people as embodied beings, audiences at a show, loved ones living in distant places, is more important than ever, and many creators crave technologies that can enable them to do this more effectively. Much of my research therefore focuses on how to help people build new gestural interactions for music, art, and games, where digital artifacts become vehicles for embodied expression and connection with others. Playfulness is a frequent friend of embodied interaction and exploration. Some of the work made with my tools that gets the most attention is joyfully silly, the Google Maps interface that you control by holding up a food from the country you'd like to visit, or the cardboard robot that waves hi back at you. But even very serious artists I've worked with talk about the value of having playful interactions with their tools in the design process, wanting to be in a friendly, exploratory dialogue with their medium as they work. Another key aim of many of my collaborators is inclusivity. Too often, our tools for making and our social structures exclude people, whether that's people with disabilities, people who lack particular knowledge or training, or people who aren't born into certain types of privilege. This is certainly true in both creative practice and technology creation. A lot of my work has focused on developing more inclusive tools and practices. For instance, the project you see on screen uses machine learning to enable children with disabilities to play new musical instruments. It also enables them to work with their teachers and carers to design these new instruments from scratch according to their own preferences and tastes. In 15 years of working closely with creators, I'm not sure I've ever had someone explicitly tell me that they want technology to help them make things that are more beautiful. And why would they? Being ugly, harsh, or startling can sometimes be fun and engaging. Further, sometimes people want to make serious work that engages with the real world, which is often not beautiful. That said, I have seen many creators make work using my tools which I would personally call beautiful, not because it conforms to some particular aesthetic standard, but precisely because the work engages with these wonderful qualities that I've listed.
I want to thank all our speakers for their wonderfully rich and provocative provocations, whose questions and themes will no doubt resonate through our remaining panels and papers and enrich the conversation to come in the roundtable later this afternoon. That's all from me for this panel. I'm going to hand back to Ramia now, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations through the afternoon.
Thank you, Susan, and contributors. Next up in our agenda, we have a session, a panel with a similar series of short talks on the topic and question more than sustainability, and that will be introduced by Professor Malcom Quinn. Before we get to that, and to leave you already thinking about that theme, we will have a 5-minute pause. Stretch, reflect. Please share your thoughts in the chat. You also know our hashtag Unbauhaus. We look forward to your response to our provocations, our perspectives as well. So 5-minute breaks, and then we will pick up with more than sustainability in our program today. Welcome back to Unbauhaus, hosted by University of the Arts London. We now switch to our second theme, our second set of issues and questions today on the topic more than sustainability. And to introduce this section and the contributors, I hand this over to Professor Malcom Quinn.
Making, curating, textiles design, international relations, graphic design, materials design, and fashion. Sustainability, and understanding what that term means, is now an urgent matter, with unequal impacts across the world and with equalities too in the voices involved in discussions about how to shift to ways of living and being within planetary constraints. The climate emergency.
Malcom, if I can interrupt you for a second in the spirit of dialogue, we have had a bit of a glitch with the technology here where we couldn't hear you for a couple of seconds. Could I ask you to start introducing again this session? It's not our fault, it's the ethers around us. Just start from the top.
Oh, good. Let's start again. So, hi, I'm Malcom Quinn. I'm Professor of Political and Cultural History, Associate Dean of Research for Camberwell, Chelsea, and Wimbledon Colleges of Art. And picking up on this theme of more than sustainability, I'm going to begin by returning us to those three terms that Ramia began with: beautiful, sustainable, inclusive, which at first glance seem to hang together. But once we introduce questions around the beautiful, and as I'm going to do, questions around the sustainable, maybe those three terms don't hang together so well. So maybe their relationships change. So the focus in this panel will be on more than sustainability. And within this theme, our speakers will explore how the climate and ecological emergency is caught up in political governance and economic structures. Our contributors come from different practices and disciplines across the university, from art making, curating, textiles design, international relations, graphic design, materials design, and fashion. And they all share the view that sustainability is now an urgent matter, with unequal impacts across the world, and with inequalities too in the voices involved in discussions about how to shift into ways of living and being within planetary constraints. The climate emergency, biodiversity and habitat loss, pollution, and all the other aspects of sustainability pose urgent questions for communities and for creative practice about how we imagine, reimagine, and build collective, equitable futures. As examples of the kind of thinking and practice that is required, today you will hear how higher education can and should support the development and enhancement of future design thinkers who challenge rather than reproduce exclusionary practices, who go beyond received opinion and the assumptions of common ideology. You will hear how circular design principles and practices can offer a sustainable and ethical roadmap and means for disciplinary expertise to come together. You will hear how curatorial and artistic practice can contribute to shaping how policy is made about complex international matters such as displacement. You'll hear that design education should put working towards sustainability on an equal footing with aesthetic concerns, and this is where beauty comes back in. You will hear how the adoption of living systems principles within design can help us to address the world's biodiversity challenge. You'll hear that fashion is a means to explore human interdependence within living systems as it connects the personal to the global, involving all clad humans, implicating life and lives in fundamental ways. You will hear also about artworks that suggest ways of imagining a new kind of environment from its grassroots upwards, embedded in our local contexts and ecosystems. You'll hear about artworks that reveal the interrelations between individual bodies and community structures, which allow explorations of diverse expressions of identity and means of cohabitation. Finally, this session offers contributions that show the potential and agency of the creative arts to pose questions, open up debate, and imagine future ways of living and being. Together, they show that sustainability is intertwined with aesthetics, politics, lived experience, communities and places, and that going beyond current assumptions about sustainability is not just possible, but essential. So with these three keywords for this panel, equitable, circular, and anticipatory in mind, I'm going to introduce our speakers who are, as we're going through them, Rahul Patel, Becky Early, Hannah Entwistle, Chapisat, The Green Ravers, Carol Collet, Dilys Williams, Henry Parkin, and Lucy Orton. Our first speaker, Rahul Patel, is a researcher, educator, content developer in contemporary art history and theory at UAL. Rahul co-curated the Decolonizing the Arts Curriculum, Perspectives on Higher Education, Zine 1 and 2. He has organized events including Challenging Times, Global Pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and Climate and Ecological Emergency at UAL. His presentation emphasizes that it's more than sustainability, it's a climate and ecological emergency, requiring total holistic ecologies of human histories of those on the planet who don't want our Earth to be scorched by profit-driven, at any cost, industrial, capitalist organizations and educational institutions. So here is the video.
It requires more than talk of sustainability. Most of us know this. Most of us hope that is more than one part of that equation. The tranquilizing methods and operations to outmaneuver and dumbfound the call to understand our movement that has made the call that we are in a climate and ecological emergency knows no bounds and is tied up in the structures of political governance and economic structural isolations of human beings having to be consumed by profit. Therefore, our response is to highlight and strike back through this devious and mischievous mode of thinking that it'll be all right in the end. The solutions to ecological denigration have always been around for human beings to enact and nurture. It constantly comes up against momentum's ideological characters, organizations, and defined structures that are delighted to plan war, militarization, and waste on an epic scale to continue this alleged mode of alleged equilibrium of condition and economic tranquility. To be more specific, the fault lines of economic division are drenched with racism, racial constructs, and embedded structural racism. The economic and the social are not indivisible to bring a realization of saving the planet. The imagination and creativity of innovators to create a planet that can breathe, grow, and festoon the human condition that is equitable has always been part of human nature. The depth of this realization affords all also to non-human beings who have no capability of shaping our future condition, nor has it the ability to do that apart from allowing itself the chance to be part of a sustainable habitat, may it be on land or be aquatic. The question that needs to be posed is, are you going to challenge the structures, the institutions, and the ideology which is able to sustain and recreate itself in the new language of carbon neutral or carbon credits? Are we going to have an anti-racist agenda which goes hand in hand to save the planet? I don't need to bring up countless examples of how the North is denigrating the global South through racial concepts and constructions. However, as a movement, we seem to fail to bring this in a convincing and thorough way. Instead, we believe that somehow, because the climate and ecological emergency is so needed, that everything else will be eclipsed in this thinking. Decarbonize and decolonize. These go hand in hand. Anti-racism needs to be part, whole scale, and in need to bring in the human conditions in the past, the present, and what we would like for the future. We are entrenched by the notion that to do this would make us weaker. In fact, the opposite is true. And therefore, participatory relationships is not just between non-humans and human beings, but also from within the human beings. The call to action requires economic equity and the ability, and not just within the confines of capitalist embodied constructions, colonial or imperial, but a fulfillment of a total human emancipation through economic and non-racist liberation.
Hello again. Our next video is from Professor Becky Early. Becky is UAL Chair of Sustainable Fashion Textile Design and co-founder director of the Centre for Circular Design at Chelsea College of Arts. Becky is an award-winning researcher, designer, maker, and communicator. In October 2021, she co-founded World Circular Textiles Day 2050, a collaborative platform working towards environmental socio-economic change. In her video, Becky will explore how circular design offers us the opportunity to create roadmaps to sustainable, equitable cultures and economies that value people and the planet over profit. Designers can build new bridges between science, economics, politics, and industry, creatively framing emergent spaces for discourse and action, challenging us through modes of making, thinking, and sharing. Thank you.
Hello, I am Professor Becky Early. I'm interested in circularity and how we can use creativity and ingenuity of designers to create more equitable materials, models and mindsets for fashion and textiles. In this short talk, I'm going to explore some project work around the theme of equitable circularity. I'm drawing upon my love of nature, my passion for change, my total commitment to working in collaboration, and above all, the designerly ways of pursuing equitable circularity. I made the service shirt in 2018 as part of the Mistra Future Fashion programme. I set out to make a garment last 50 years through designing in ultimate longevity at the outset. Starting with a plain white recycled polyester top, the research took me on a journey through the wardrobes of users and the studios of makers. I time travelled with the shirt to rental schemes in-house with brands, to lending libraries in Amsterdam. For a shirt to last 50 years, it needs to be a very social object. I found that the shirt could be designed in such a way as to build up tonal patterns over time, and to make it work, it would move through local loops between users, borrowers, cleaners, remakers, and craftspeople. Our circular economies depend on loops with low carbon footprints, so the products need to be made to travel well. When the pandemic hit, I began noticing how our fashion habits changed very suddenly. I watched my family and those around me work out how to dress well in new ways. This inspired me to map out how the family of the future might have circular fashion. Taking the physical and psychological needs of each person as the starting point, I sketched out the services that would suit. I found there was room for a great variety of offers. local makers, entrepreneurs and service providers will play a key role. In the Chariosity project, I asked stakeholders how they might use design education to help charity shops recover from the impacts of lockdown. In the UK, charities lost £28 million each month. Working online in Miro, I brought a diverse range of people together to map out new systems-level solutions through marrying design education briefs with local causes and strategic partnership with brands and organisations. This Australian project between Uber and the Red Cross served as one point of inspiration for us. With circular solutions, we need the big brands to support the ground-level, grassroots actions of others. Resale options in supermarket chains is quite literally taking the food out of people's mouths. On the 8th of October 2020, we launched World Circular Textiles Day 2050 with co-founders Worn Again Technologies and Circular Economy Amsterdam. It's a platform where multiple roadmaps for change can be brought together through creative endeavour to create inspiring visions for the circular industry so many of us desire in the textile and fashion world. What we need with the new European Bauhaus are opportunities that enable designers to drive the development of systems-level models that bring together local flows of waste with the needs of the region, supported by influential and generous strategic partnerships. Thank you.
Hello again. Our next talk is from Hannah Entwistle-Chapuisat, PhD candidate, Chelsea College of Arts, UAL, and curator. Hannah is also the founder of Displacement: Uncertain Journeys. A lawyer by training, her research draws upon her humanitarian work with the UN and others to explore how art can contribute to international norm development and protect people displaced by climate change impacts. Hannah's talk will interrogate how the expansive and interconnected impacts of climate change on communities and ecosystems, including the displacement of people, challenge the limits of human cognition. As well as this, she explores how policy-oriented artistic practice can inspire interdisciplinary critical thinking and problem-solving through sensory and effective means that reveal challenges, provoke conversation, interpret existing data, and generate new knowledge. Thank you.
As the European Commission develops its plan for the new European Bauhaus, I would encourage it to consider how policy-oriented artistic practice can contribute to action at the local, national, and international level. My doctoral research at UAL focuses on the protection needs of people displaced by climate change impacts. We now know that some 23 million people are newly displaced each year by disasters, far exceeding those displaced by conflict. We also know that in the absence of action, climate change is expected to only increase those numbers. Sustainable approaches to tackling the climate emergency also need to protect the human rights of displaced people. However, the scale of numbers like these and the complexity of the solutions required to address them can be overwhelming and difficult to comprehend. Grounded in my initial training in law and my work with the United Nations and others, my research explores how art practice and research can help address complex international policy challenges like disaster displacement. Displacement: Uncertain Journeys is a collaborative art project working in partnership with artists, states, NGOs, academic institutions, and UN organizations to create opportunities to understand disaster displacement from a visual, experiential, and emotional perspective. I initiated the project when I was working as a researcher at the Nansen Initiative, a group of states concerned about disaster displacement. I felt that art could help address both the factual and emotional elements of displacement that were difficult for me to convey in written reports. The project was formally established in 2015 through a partnership between the Nansen Initiative and the late Professor Chris Wainwright and his team at UAL. The Displacement Project continues today in collaboration with the state-led Platform on Disaster Displacement, or PDD, UAL, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Humanitarian Collaborative at the University of Virginia, and others. At its core, displacement is an experiment in how to bring art to bear on specific policy issues. We develop art interventions about disaster displacement for policymakers rather than the general public. We curated this more traditional exhibition featuring the work of 9 artists through a commission by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. However, our ultimate aim is to bring art into the very heart of intergovernmental policy making. We love artworks that directly engage delegates and help prompt conversations. We not only show artworks, but also facilitate direct conversation between artists and policymakers at international conferences. At COP25, we partnered with PDD and Cole Films at the UN's Task Force on Displacement official side event, and provided artists and policymakers at the French Pavilion an opportunity to explore how they can collaborate to improve international responses to disaster displacement. I believe policy-oriented artistic practice can contribute in specific ways to policymaking processes, for instance, by making complex challenges visible, but also encouraging and provoking interdisciplinary debate and generating new knowledge and evidence through art research. Art is not unique in this respect. However, art can draw on its capacity to engage emotions and affect. Our displacement interventions in busy conference spaces have sought to create opportunities for informal exchange and reflection using highly visible, immersive, and interactive installations. However, given the opportunity, art has the potential to contribute to complex policymaking processes in numerous other ways. The expansive and interconnected impacts of climate change on communities and ecosystems, including the displacement of people, challenge the limits of human cognition. Policy-oriented artistic practice can inspire interdisciplinary critical thinking and problem solving through sensory and affective means that reveal challenges, provoke conversation, interpret existing data, and generate new knowledge. Thank you.
Hello again. Our next talk is from the Green Ravers, who are Tara MacDonald, Solomon Olsen, and Abby Ingleby. They are a collective formed of 3 students from Chelsea College of Art's Graphic Design BA Honours Programme. They attempt to initiate a more sustainable design practice and education within their course and throughout the college. They question, can design educations be creative and sustainable, or by the process of making and learning, do we inevitably create wasteful outcomes? They determined that design education should place sustainability with equal importance with the aesthetic, particularly in the context of nurturing responsible future designers. Thank you.
Hey everyone, we're the Green Ravers and we consist of Tara, Abby and myself, Solomon. We're a student-led group from UAL and we explore and initiate more sustainable ways of thinking, learning and making at our uni. Today we're going to be looking at the role and the aims of designers, as well as the relationship between sustainability and creativity in art. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Tara.
An important question for us to ask is, how can the content of our design courses be the same if the role of the designer has changed? Looking back to the ideas of one of the pioneers of socially and ecologically oriented design, Victor Papanek, in this diagram of his vision of the design team, he predicted the need for the shift in what the aim of our design should be. We've started to see more designers move from being mainly makers and highly skilled craft persons, for example traditional type foundries and so on, to revolutionary thinkers with a responsibility to guide society in a better direction for the future. Arguably, computers and technology have left these manual skills redundant or less necessary, and have allowed the recent rise of social design and designers working across multiple realms. If this is true, then it seems vital for course leaders to recognise this and integrate aspects of these new ways of thinking and working into design courses alongside the established curriculum. However, this doesn't mean that the traditions of tactile making in design should stop altogether.
Making and exploring creatively is fundamental to an art and design education. We grow and develop as creatives through learning what doesn't work, But what happens to all those projects just don't work? They become waste, whether physical waste we are unable to recycle due to its components, or digital waste that carries just as much as a carbon footprint. As a hands-on graphic designer myself, I'm incredibly conscious that every experiment I make in studios has an impact on our planet. As future designers, our education should incorporate responsible making to ensure our 3-year undergrad courses aren't 3 years of detrimental production for the sake of it. Whether it be learning how to develop film without the use of highly toxic chemicals, or being educated on the VOCs, heavy metals and other damaging components of screen printing inks and letterpress inks, we should be encouraged to make informed decisions about the creative processes as students. I don't want to lose who I am as a designer and as a student, but I want to ensure that my education properly advises me and my peers of how to create sustainably for the health of our planet and for the longevity of an art and design education. We'd like to thank you for listening and hope that you take away this message. Students are the future generation of designers. What we are taught now is the building blocks for how we will ultimately practice in the future. If that practice doesn't include sustainable ways of making and thinking, we are a detriment to our planet. Now think, can design educations be both sustainable and creative?
Next talk is from Professor Carole Collet, Professor in Design for Sustainable Futures at Central St. Martin's. Carole is also co-director of the Living Systems Lab Research Group at CSM UAL. Carole's research questions, can design help save our biodiversity? How can design evolve into a non-anthropocentric activity and integrate multi-species thinking? Instead of using nature as a resource, designers, she thinks, must shift towards a regenerative practice to help repair both our climate and biodiversity. We can achieve this by adopting a living systems thinking approach to design, and this calls for a radical reinvention of our design methodologies and mindsets. Thank you.
My name is Carole Collet. I'm a professor in Design for Sustainable Futures at Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London. Today I want to invite you to think about designing for a more than human world. My provocation is a call for action to the creative sector to help save our biodiversity and adopt living systems thinking principles in design. And I'll explain this. So first of all, we know that biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. Current extinction rates are around 100 to 1,000 times higher than the baseline rate, and they are increasing. This is from a report published earlier this year, but we have known this for a while now. Yet, in my view, biodiversity is too often in the shadow of the climate emergency. Limiting the warming of our climate will help, but there are many other factors that are responsible for our biodiversity collapse. Invasive species, intensive agriculture, or habitat loss due to rapid urban development. Human expansion has been so fast in the past few decades that between 1992 and 2014, the stock of natural capital per person declined by nearly 40%. This is huge. So can design actually help save our biodiversity? Can design evolve into a non-anthropocentric activity that integrates multi-species thinking? And how do we shift design towards a practice which is regenerative and helps repair and restore our climate and biodiversity? How do we connect the dots between our biosphere and our design activities? Well, I believe the way forward for design is to adopt living systems principle. Here I reference Capra, a leading voice in this field, and the tenets of living systems thinking are very simple. All life on Earth is interconnected. And we need to understand the dynamics, the patterns, the relationships, the context inherent to all life forms if we want to design a better future. So instead of thinking in terms of objects or products, designers need to think in terms of material flow, patterns, relationships, and systems. And a growing number of designers are embracing this new mindset to explore new ways to design for multi-species. So very briefly, I want to show you some examples here We can see on the left the work of Suzanne Wieland from Material Futures, who is using design tools to reveal the crucial role of pavement cracks to support urban biodiversity, and in particular our urban solitary bees. Christoph Dischmann uses gamification to create a new app and a new game that can help repopulate endemic endangered butterflies. And with Maison Zero, Aaron Rocamarassia and Brigitte Koch created a new material made from the byproducts of invasive species in the UK, the Japanese knotwood and the American crayfish. And this was done in order to incentivize further the removal of these species. This will in turn help the survival rate of endemic life forms. And Louis Hundritz from MA Biodesign has created insect and seed capsules bespoke to the Champagne terroir to facilitate a transition to permaculture vineyards. So design here helps moving away from a monoculture agricultural model towards a permaculture model, beneficial to our life systems. So we have a new generation of designers ready to face the challenge, embracing this new mindset, but we need to do more and much more. So let's make designing for multi-species part of our core creative practice. Thank you.
Our next talk is Professor Dilys Williams, founder and director of Centre for Sustainable Fashion and UAL Professor of Fashion Design for Sustainability. Dilys engages participatory and transformation design to connect fashion's ecological, social, economic, and cultural dimensions. Dilys's work shapes and contributes to the field of fashion design for sustainability through academic publications, exhibitions, knowledge exchange partnerships, media, and public events. In this talk, Dilys will reflect on how we live in times of unraveling and the unraveling of disciplines, subjects, and professions due to social, ecological, and personal crisis, thus necessitating an ecological educational paradigm, a shift from the mechanistic, rational to the participative, emergent practices in learning interdependence. This lens for seeing, knowing, and making involves learning to let go of outmoded understandings of ourselves and the world. Fashion is an apt means to explore interdependence as it connects the personal to the global, involving all clad humans, implicating life and lives in fundamental ways. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dilys Williams, Professor of Fashion Design for Sustainability and Director at Centre for Sustainable Fashion, University of the Arts, London. The social, planetary and health crisis is coinciding with vast technological breakthroughs. This is changing how life is experienced, and our ability to thrive depends on how we recognise ourselves in this world and what our intentions are. It's about practicing what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, the fundamental interdependence of all phenomena, and an understanding that as individuals and societies we are all embedded in the cyclical processes of nature. It takes humility to recognise how much we don't know about how to contribute to this, and imagination and creativity to do so. Art and design education is very well placed to do this. But as John Ehrenfeld says, it is the arrogance of humanism that has led us to our current predicament. The call out to demonstrate ways to live well together within nature's boundaries is nothing new. Indeed, we've had a century of voices, Buckminster Fuller, Rachel Carson, Gregory Bateson, the list goes on. Awareness has risen, but so has the noise of distraction. We don't need more education, but education of a certain kind. David Orr. The current education system is a carbon-based colonial system that produces ever more clever vandals of the world and each other. The most radical move that education can make right now is to guide our learners towards a caring, compassionate, imaginative approach to making, where beauty is a manifestation of our distinctiveness within a wider interconnectedness. A shift from a mechanistic to an ecological paradigm for education involves a pedagogy that is participatory. It creates conditions for agency for all. And futures thinking is not based on only the past to predict the next, but, as Richard Sennett says, it's an exploration of what isn't yet, but could be. This new system of education requires a shift in the why, the how, and the with whom as well as the what of teaching and learning. At Centre for Sustainable Fashion, we've been exploring this for a while, creating a heuristic, a provocation at the intersection of imagination and praxis. It explores agendas at play for all learners. With that, we're trying out and refining a set of pedagogies that interweave deep ecology and empathy with informed decision-making based on science-based targets. It's about transformation design. We're excited about the paths our graduates are making, but we have never been more concerned. The commoditization of sustainability terms to falsely validated, outmoded systems of business and education are a dangerous distraction. We must amplify conditions for new perceptions, but we must simultaneously negate that which is destroying life and lives. At UAL, this is manifest in a commitment to be an anti-racist university. This is essential. We must also be an anti-exploitative university in environmental terms and act on the intersectionality of racism, classism, sexism in climate justice. This is the only way that we will reach inclusivity and equilibrium. Just as the first Bauhaus curriculum was about education shaping and being shaped by new knowledge and practice that was relevant in the early 20th century, so must a new education now shape and be shaped by a knowledge and practice of interdependence that is beyond humanist confines. The role of designers and educators is one of co-inquiry. Thus, we make sense of ourselves and each other in the world and look for ways to put that sense into practice. We look forward to exploring this further with those we know and those we are yet to know. Thank you.
Our next talk is from Henry Parkin. Henry is a recent graduate from Central St. Martin's and winner of the LVMH Maison/Zero This Earth Award. His practice is concerned with techno-ecology and helping to create an artwork of our surroundings, using natural technologies, and by reimagining published scientific knowledge, he makes devices which perform ecological functions. His talk is concerned with how practicing techno-ecology on a creature-by-creature basis affords us the benefits of modular, adaptable ecological solutions. With the accessibility of knowledge via the internet, we're empowered to help realize a new kind of environment from its grassroots upwards, embedded in our local contexts and ecosystems. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Henry, and I'm going to talk briefly about techno-ecology in our local environments and how we can help to be more than just sustainable. And the three important pillars of how I think this is possible are collaborating with non-human organisms, working locally, and implementing these solutions in a modular way. And I'll start with collaboration. So all sorts of different kinds of natural technologies exist, possessed by different organisms, which can decontaminate and purify the air or the water or the earth, or create electricity out of nutrients. And by collaborating with other species of organisms, we can co-enable one another to enact useful change in our shared habitat, and we can co-create things which will perform ecological functions for the good of every living thing in that local ecosystem. So working locally is the main pillar of doing this. So practicing a DIY techno-ecology can be done by anybody, and by each working to sustain our local landscapes by focusing technological innovation towards ecology, we can create new kinds of cyborg environments which will grow from their grassroots upwards. They'll be rich with biodiversity, and we can all riff this wealth of scientific knowledge which is becoming increasingly accessible via the internet. So like watching YouTube tutorials on how to make something interesting, we can create devices that will perform useful ecological functions in our back gardens, on our streets, in our local towns, in our cities. And finally, unpacking the scale interdependency in living systems should underpin the intentions of innovation design in this context. And it can help us to understand how environmental solutions can be implemented in a modular way, such as by engineering machine creatures designed to perform ecological functions in their ecosystems. So a modular approach to problem solving in living systems means that you could create a few more creatures if you wanted to decontaminate an environment more effectively, or remove them all if you're in danger of damaging an ecosystem, and take them apart and rebuild them one by one. So rather than fitting rigid prosthetics to our environment and risking overriding the living systems that we inhabit, modular technoecology installed on a creature-by-creature basis could be as adaptable and as dynamic as a living system itself, in a kind of symbiosis with the landscape. Thank you for listening.
Our final talk today is from Professor Lucy Orta, Chair of Art and the Environment at London College of Fashion. Lucy Orta's visual arts practice investigates the interrelations between the individual body and community structures, exploring diverse expressions of identity and means of cohabitation. Working collaboratively, her long-term projects address ecological challenges, which include meta-themes, Antarctica and Amazonia, that form umbrella frameworks for a wide range of artistic outcomes. In recognition of her contribution to sustainability, she has received the Green Leaf Award for Artistic Excellence with an Environmental Message, presented by the United Nations Environment Programme in 2007. And her message for her talk is quite simple, that there are no winners or losers in a world of cooperation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lucy Orta, Professor of Art and the Environment. I'm going to talk about two projects today, Antarctica World Passport and Symphony for Absent Wildlife. The Antarctica World Passport project has been installed in a range of locations worldwide and has encountered diverse audiences, from high-ranking government officials and UN representatives to passers-by on the street. These multiple points of engagement serve as discursive hubs from which symbolic world passports are distributed. Accompanying these installations is an online platform that serves as a repository for the passport citizens. It locates and unites individuals from across the world. Over 33,000 people have joined the online passport community, connected through a shared set of values, and 72,000 passports have now been printed. Antarctica's extreme climate imposes mutual aid and freedom of research. The landscape, a blank white canvas, contains all the wishes of humanity. The continent embodies utopia and spreads a message of hope for future generations. The passport was launched following an extraordinary expedition to found and install the ephemeral Antarctic village, symbolising the multiplicity and diversity of peoples. In the Antarctica flag, each national identity hugs each other, hand in hand, their borders merging into one, an emblem of unification, an extraordinary common identity of which we all form part of. In the Heads and Tails football match played in Antarctica to celebrate the founding of the world community, the players' soccer shirts are stitched with all the nation's colours. There are no winners or losers in this world of cooperation. Deep in the forest foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Canada, the performance Symphony for Absent Wildlife was filmed. Woolen felt from former military hospital blankets is a material used for the orchestra's costume. It is shaped into masks of species connected with the spirit belief system of the indigenous peoples. The creatures, bison, wolf, eagle, beaver, once abundant across Canada, were hunted to near extinction. Locked in this cycle of disappearance is a history of the point blanket, woven in the north of England and traded for beaver pelts in Alberta. The resulting capote coat gradually effacing the cultural identity of the First Nations people. A quadraphonic score, composed for the film, is played on hand-turned wooden bird whistles, echoing what we're in danger of losing.
All our speakers for those excellent talks, which I hope you'll agree will have set you thinking about the place of this word sustainable within the triad of the beautiful, the sustainable, and the inclusive that Ramia began with. And they've done that, I think, through looking at these three key words I mentioned: equitable, circular, and anticipatory. So with that in mind, and those reflections hopefully taking forward to the next panel, I'm handing over to Ramia. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm and contributors, for that truly thought-provoking set of provocations and thoughts. We will now have 3 minutes break to stretch, to reflect. Please share your thoughts via the chat or the hashtag Unbauhaus. We'll see you back in 3 minutes for our third session or panel on matters of inclusion. Welcome back and to our third set of perspectives on the topic, More Matters of Inclusion, where we'll be exploring sensory, creative, and diverse engagements. This will be introduced by Ben Stopher.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Ben Stopher, and I'm the Dean of the UAL Creative Computing Institute. So, the provocations in matters of inclusion. This session aims to interrogate current social and economic infrastructures that result in inequalities, exclusion, and marginalization, and highlight creative ways to address these enduring issues. Our speakers come from different traditions and perspectives, including computer science and financial services, sound art, social design, media studies, and creative practice. You will hear that contradictions embedded into institutions such as UAL result in exclusions and elitism. You will hear that gender inequalities are manifested through contemporary social structures, including financial institutions and pensions, but these can be reimagined. You will hear how the invisible sphere of sound art can alert us to the organization of the visual world and how it reproduces inequalities. You will hear how social design within the Global South can often be restricted to Eurocentric obligations. You will hear how exclusionary practices were built into network technologies, opening up a long history of silences and absences. You will hear how belonging, participation, and inclusion can be reimagined within art, design, and creativity. Being alert to inclusions and exclusions and how they're embedded in creative practices, institutions, technologies, and ways of knowing is an important part of dismantling them. To remake these requires challenge, contestation, and collaboration. Today's speakers give us insights into how to do this. For our first talk, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peaks Krafft. Peaks is a senior lecturer and MA Internet Equalities course leader here at the UAL Creative Computing Institute. Dr. Krafft undertakes critically oriented computer science research, academic organizing, and community organizing. The provocation in this talk, entitled Homogeneity and Exclusion at UAL, Dr. Krafft will explain why two of UAL's strategic goals, one of being the elite world-leading arts institution, and two, achieving meaningful diversity and inclusion, are fundamentally at odds with each other. For Dr. Krafft, elitism is indistinguishable from concentration of power, and therefore indistinguishable from exclusion.
Hi, I'm Dr. Peaks Krafft from the Creative Computing Institute, and in this short no-frills talk, I'll be trying to persuade you that two of the strategic goals that UAL has of being a leading arts university and of diversity and inclusion are fundamentally at odds with each other. First, I want to start with a couple definitions. And so I'll be using these two words, or two phrases, elite and concentration of power, to mean that within groups, communities, sectors, industries, or societies, an elite is a group who is associated with power, and that group is only accessible to a few. And I'll be using concentration of power to mean the existence of a powerful elite. Speaking about the University of the Arts London, one of the aspects of UAL's strategic plan is to be a world-leading arts university. And as you've probably seen in UAL's advertising and publicity materials, we're quite proud and in some ways quite fixated on being a top-ranked arts university as one measure of that world-leading institution. However, UAL can only be a top university if others are below it. So why is exclusion central to elitism? In other words, why is it only possible for UAL to be an elite university if it excludes others? Without some who have positions of power over others, there is no concentration of power. Therefore, excluding others from positions of power enables power over others, or the concentration of power. Exclusion is achieved by artificially limiting institutional resources so that power can be held in the hands of a few. If education was made free and openly available and credentialing was abolished, there would be no basis for disparity in educational qualifications to justify the selection of particular people to positions of power. What we currently use for applications, selection for university admissions or for job posts at UAL, qualifications and standards of excellence, identify people who are similar to you rather than who are different, and structurally exclude applicants from diverse racial, ethnic, national, religious, class, etc. backgrounds. An alternative is to accept that qualifications, as we conceive them, are narrow and unnecessary, that work could be driven by workers' skills and interests rather than projected needs of the Institute. Consider that traditional qualifications is really code for colonial qualifications. Contemporary academic standards were formulated by centuries of European men to insulate themselves and justify their position of rule by a white elite, noting that white people are a global minority. Appreciate people who are different from you as an alternative to strictly following what we consider to be qualifications or standards of excellence in some cases. Consider, this person is so different from me. They must bring such a fresh perspective that my students and I could learn so much from.
For our next provocation, Daniella Jenkins, doctoral candidate currently funded for a studentship between UAL's Social Design Institute and King's College London, will talk about her research that builds on professional and academic experiences using perspectives from design, social policy, and critical futures to investigate how pensions for people retiring by 2060 might be designed along feminist lines. The provocation here, Daniella proclaims, to shape the future of Europe as a creative and interdisciplinary movement, we must be cognizant of the private and public ways in which gender inequalities are manifested. To create sustainable futures, we must ensure that we do not continue to build on the foundations of past inequalities.
I'm a PhD candidate funded through a studentship between UAL Social Design Institute and King's College London. And my research asks how pensions for people retiring by 2060 might be designed along feminist lines. Now, my route to this research was not traditional, and in casting back to the genesis of the ideas that brought me to focus on equal futures, I revisited an artifact from my own past, my piggy bank, Annabelle. Now, I must have been 8 or 9 when I saved up enough money for a piggy bank that shared my middle name. And in that one act, I bought into an institution, yes, the bank, but also a certain idea about the future, which is built on assumptions about value, individual consumption, money, and ideas of compound interest, which are fueled at their heart by beliefs about an ever-expanding economy. Now, what I didn't know then, but hopefully know now, is that there are clear dividing lines in financial futures, and the clearest line is actually gender. In almost all pension systems in the world, a woman receives less income in retirement than if she were a man. And not only did I find this shocking, but I also found that in the UK, this situation is projected to continue to at least the year 2050. And the working assumption that we're using at the moment is that the future that we're all creating will be gendered. My research is a provocation, one which challenges this assumption. I firstly asked the question of, well, how did we get here? Why, for example, does only some work to fill the piggy bank, while we anticipate that other worthwhile and valid work, such as looking after children or the old, should be done for free? Who do these assumptions serve? The second question that I ask is, how do we perpetuate, recreate, and sustain inequalities through our own practices and beliefs? Do women, for example, work part-time because it makes sense? Or have we created institutions that make it more logical to assume that women's work is worthless, both now and in the future? These are complex questions that ask us to challenge the public and private ways in which gender inequalities are manifested, such as what do we mean by work? What constitutes economic activity? Who cares? And for whom? And even in our most intimate relationships, what does a shared future look like? And how can we contribute towards them equitably? I argue that in order for us to create sustainable futures, we must ensure that we don't continue to build on the foundations of past inequities, whether that's building on the unpaid labor of women or redistributing finite resources from the global south to perpetuate our lifestyles in the global north, as we currently do through our financialized pension system. My work can't resolve all of the issues around inequalities. So instead, I look to frame the future as a set of possibilities where outcomes are not set. I imagine multiple possible futures where in each there remain options to design and build in deliberative ways that don't trade off the needs of the young against the old or vice versa, and importantly, recognize the needs of men, women, and everyone in between. Thank you.
Our next provocation is by Professor Salome Vogelijn, Professor of Sound at the London College of Communication. She's also a practicing artist and writer and works with listening as a socio-political practice of sound. She writes essays, books, and tech scores for performance and publication. Her practice engages in participatory, collective, and communal approaches. Her provocation, Salome theorizes that sonic sensibility opens a portal to sensory knowing that does not deny a visual epistemology, but questions its hegemony and pluralizes how we can know from the invisible, the embodied, the tacit, and the contingent, and therefore pluralizes what and who can be part of the knowledge discourse.
Hi, I'm Salome Vogelijn, Professor of Sound at CRISAP, the Centre for Creative Research into Sound Art Practice at the London College of Communication, UAL. I work on sound as a practitioner and a theorist, doing things with and about sonic materiality, listening and sounding. In particular, I consider and practice its relational and temporal, as well as its porous and participatory materialization in relation to aesthetics and artistic practice, as well as in relation to political and social issues. I am interested in what the invisible sphere of sound can tell us about the organization of the visual world. Amongst other things, I'm currently the principal investigator of an HRC-funded research project into listening as a cross-disciplinary practice. listeningacrossdisciplines.net. We investigate the status and function of listening in various disciplines to explore a current use of sounding and listening in science, social science, and the arts and humanities, to understand its limits and to establish a wider scope for sound, to add to how people work and produce research, and ultimately how we know the world. Not only from a visual dimension and its tools, but also from the invisible, the sensory, and the embodied. In the background of this research is the suggestion that in the West we live in an extremely visual-centric culture. We experience reality in relation to what is measurable, quantifiable, objectively knowable. This produces a visual knowledge of the world because it positions itself at a distance of the thing we investigate, denying any more experiential and subjective engagement, while at the same time being oriented towards knowledge as capture, comprehension, and domination. Sound that is not visually represented or systematized does not fit into this knowledge scheme. It is the excess and the overflow to this objectivity. It cannot be pressed into the service of a visual knowledge system and its ideologies, and therefore it is ignored and excluded. If not from the data gathering itself, then from the interpretative and analytical stages. But by ignoring the sonic, we ignore many knowledge possibilities and the variety of other ways to see and hear the world and to be a subject in the world. In other words, we deny plural knowledge systems and plural knowledge participants. Sound challenges the visual epistemology because it confronts it with the exclusions of its rationale. And it reveals the politics of this rationale within the logic of the colonial. In turn, it offers us another way to know the world that is tacit, sensory, embodied, participatory, and local, that might seem less consensual and repeatable, the cornerstone of scientific truth, but that is therefore more inclusive of a diversity of knowledges and knowledge agents, and plural in the way of how we understand our being in the world. The motivation for working with sound, then, is to use it as an access point and portal to a sensory knowledge that does not deny the knowledge of the objective, but questions its hegemony, and that pluralizes how we can know from the sensory and the contingent, and therefore what and who can be part of knowledge discourse.
Our next provocation is from Delina Evans. She is a service designer and researcher on the DOSA project at London College of Communication. She is currently co-designing user-driven diagnostics to manage antimicrobial resistance across humans, animals, and the environment in India. Concurrently, her PhD focuses on untangling service design from its Eurocentric roots to become more culturally sensitive to the localities of the Global South. Delina's provocation and research looks at how designing inclusively and diversely for social issues across the Global South is often restricted by Eurocentric obligations that are irrelevant to cultures outside Europe. She poses the question, how can we co-design in locally grounded ways without compromising the approaches in which our outputs are measured by the funders in the Global North?
Hello, my name is Delina and I'm a PhD student and research assistant on a project called DOSA, which is co-designing diagnostic services to manage antimicrobial resistance in India. And my provocation will be in the context of social innovation in the Global South. My main question asks, when designers are awarded European funding to work in the Global South, how are they contributing to rethinking local engagement and project outputs, even when the work may be framed in traditional epistemologies of Western research? To put this into context, as part of the DOSA project, one of our measurable outputs was to lower antibiotic usage through developing tests for urinary tract infections, or UTIs, at primary health centres in rural parts of India. However, this is a Western perspective on the role of diagnostics as medical hardware, rather than seeing it as something that is responsive to a local setting. And initial design ethnography revealed that our assumption that patients will just automatically visit a health centre were unfounded, because there was very little reporting of UTI symptoms. So we expanded our fieldwork beyond primary health centres and into community level. And with close involvement from our local team members, we had co-design sessions and semi-structured interviews with community members around symptoms, their health and well-being routines. And we also try to immerse ourselves into local practices, from how to appropriately greet one another to when chai should be offered and drank. And as we engaged with the communities, not just as if they were participants, but also as hosts welcoming us as guests into their lands, we started to build familiarity, relationships and trust between the local communities and ourselves. We had really humbling experiences, for example, of being invited to participants' homes and villages where we spent time with their families and neighbours. And through experiencing snapshots of how their daily lives unfolded we continuously learn and adapt our co-design activities to the social hierarchies, the local knowledge around health, and the cultural belief systems that underpin the community's everyday practices. The thing is, one of the challenges for us now is that many of our measurable outputs are still the same as what they were at the start of the project 2 years ago. And so this takes me back to my provocation. How should the contribution of designers be recognized and valued in building inclusive relationships and trust with communities, which are critical for addressing wicked problems when the attention is focused on Western systems of knowledge that have little meaning for the communities? And how might we, as designers, push for more flexibility and diversity in the ways that our activities are measured, so that they are continuously responding to the ongoing insights revealed from our engagements with communities? And with that, I say thank you.
Our next provocation is from Dr. Zoetanya Sujon. She's the Programme Director for Communications and Media at London College of Communication. Zoe draws from an interdisciplinary lens to address the relationships between new technologies and social life, focusing on social media technologies, platforms, data surveillance, sharing culture, belonging and exclusion. Her provocation is challenging the myths of technical inclusion. This brief talk unpacks belonging and inclusion in network technologies, opening up a long history of exclusion. These myths reveal a hope for a better future and remind us that power, justice, and human rights are essential for more inclusive network technologies.
Hi, my name is Dr. Zoetanya Sujon, and I'm here to talk to you about matters of inclusion in network technologies. So one of the driving forces in my decades-long career of looking at new technologies and the ways in which belonging, participation, and inclusion are invested, intertwined, woven into the technologies that we use. One of my ambitions has been to make visible the mechanisms of belonging and exclusion in network technologies. What I've learned is that from the very beginnings of electronic technologies as we know them today, from the telephone, the telegraph, the radio, all of these universal technologies which were declared to be game-changing, democratizing forces which would bring universities, education, knowledge, community, and communication to the masses. Ever since we've begun thinking about networked electronic technologies, we have wrestled with the mythologies of technological inclusion. These include principles like the newer the better, the shinier, the bigger, the more expensive, the better these technologies are going to be for us, and that they're going to be for other people. Related to that, the more people who can reach or access these technologies, the better. And the more people means all people. There's an erasure around what it means to have particular people and particular exclusions and particular inclusions. And this is something that many scholars have documented from the beginnings of very early electronic technologies. Another myth driving this idea that technologies are in their nature more inclusive is that technological growth equals social progress. The faster the network, the more advanced the ways in which we can connect, the more social progress we'll have. However, history shows, as we can see from this image of a telephone operator, a highly gendered form of labor around the telephone, that that's not always the case. Indeed, some technologies bring with them very fixed ideas about who, when, and how people can participate in public, with each other, and within those network technologies. So some of this work, which I think has been hugely inspiring and going on for a very long time, is about challenging these myths. So this can go back to Lisa Nakamura, who was looking at race in cyberspace, when cyberspace was the end-all, be-all solution to exclusion. She's been writing about that since, the 2000s. There are many before her, but if we just look at network technologies related to the internet, there's many more that have happened. The image you see comes from the work of Safiya Noble, who looks at algorithms and the ways in which algorithms are built upon racist presumptions about who and how and when particular kinds of people do particular kinds of work. It's an amazing work, and there's many other scholars who've done research looking and challenging at how it is that technology is inclusive, finding quite the opposite, that technologies are exclusive. However, drawing from the decades of research that I've done in this area, I would argue that there are a few lessons that we can bring forward to think about what inclusive technologies might be. For me, one of the primary starting points is about power. You cannot think about technologies without first thinking about power, before, with, and after technology. It's not an add-on, it's an absolute essential starting point. Context matters. You cannot decontextualize where it is that technologies come from and who it is that uses them. The last point I'd say is that human rights are both local, and there might be variation around localities and the specifics of communities and contexts. However, they're also global. And this is a particular issue we're really wrestling with right now when the global legal and economic and regulatory system is out of step with the power that technologies and platforms have at the moment. So what you also see in front of you is a list of the keywords that come up when I draw the mission statements from my favorite, most inspiring research centers, the Data Justice Lab, the Ada Lovelace Institute, all of whom are highlighting the importance of data, the importance of justice, and the importance of power. So these are the things I think that are important when we think about what we need to do for inclusive technologies. Thank you.
Our final provocation is from Christopher Lutterodt-Quarcoo, an entrepreneur, internationally exhibiting designer, award-winning director, writer, global speaker, and lecturer. Operating at the axis of design, politics, and film, CLQ is the director of the ADV, an immersive forum that weaponizes empathy for societal progress, change, and impact for change makers. Their provocation in matters of inclusion. The ADV Immersive Forum weaponizes empathy as a tool to embody the mindset and motivations of actors in pivotal policies, agendas, and decisions impacting citizens. CLQ expresses that we are moving away from accusations and embracing understanding to create counter moves. Controversial, without a doubt. Necessary, beyond belief.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Christopher Lutterodt-Quarcoo, and this is my presentation on matters of inclusion, specifically looking through the lens of one of my practices or organizations. Overall, I operate as a creative entrepreneur, designer, and researcher. I am the director of an organization and company called the ADV, which is short for the Adversary or the Advocate. And I also run an organization called Unmaterialized, which is a research archive. And I work with UAL and occasional other universities around the world as a lecturer, coordinator, and curriculum designer. Just to give you a quick introduction, the ADV is, as I said, a strategic insight firm, but we work across a variety of scales. And what we've got here is an actual innovation that we've created called the Empathy Axis. And that is a device that we created that is nomadic, that folds down and actually accommodates 8 individuals that have their own bespoke screen, speaker, and LED light that floods an entire room, creating a simulation of decisions that need to be made in the heat of the moment. But in this case, it's within a 2-hour experience. Overall, this experience encapsulates 12 scenarios, which round up to 24 experiences, primarily because each scenario allows you to choose which angle you want to approach it from, adversary or advocate. Of course, the world is not limited to just for and against, but what that allows you to do is to narrow down which side of the spectrum you wish to explore. And each of our scenarios cover 12 pillars of society, covering citizenship, religion, media and mass communications, cultural institutions and history, technology, state affairs, identity, cultural practices, knowledge, environmentalism, war, and also financial infrastructures. And choosing one of these brings people together to decide they're interested in one area, and then they decide whether they want to argue or pursue a task in the for or the against kind of angle. One of the things that we utilize in order to help people go through the experience is to understand the methodologies in which they want to achieve their goal. And part of that is about understanding, creating an opportunity for them to really define what their perspective is and who they want to be as a unit. And that particular identity that they choose comes with their own natural limitations or lack of limitations in moral decisions and tactics that they wish to use. So we have created an index of 150 tactics that they can draw from, and they can create on their own to amalgamate together to produce a strategy. Primarily, what we're really focusing on here are the opportunities for participants to experience power, to create impact, and to define change in their area of interest. And what we produce at the end of it is a bespoke evaluation that encompasses cognitive, psychosocial, and behavioral, and their behavioral performance evaluation. That's based on what they know, how their experience has impacted them, who they're with, and what it is that they've dealt with in terms of their encounter or their proximity to some of those experiences that they're trying to judge or trying to work with. And then we're looking at world builders, which is typically quite an exclusive experience. But what we're talking about here is about curating contrast in terms of having non-exclusive clients or participants that are locally sourced, as well as working on the periphery of those areas of interest, so they can bring their versatility of thought. And the outcomes that they produce are mainly two key things, apart from the strategies that they piece together. It would be understanding an individual intelligence report, which encompasses the 3 psychological assessments which are above, but also a collective intelligence report, which is looking at all the different ways in which the best or the most unique approaches to their problem have been addressed, not just through their cohort, but through multiple others, which they can review and listen to through the audio documentation, which has included national leadership, people that have worked in government, people that are working on the front line, people that have worked in institutions, and those that are coming together as a unit to figure out how do we make this happen. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up our Matters of Inclusion panel, and I think you'll all agree that there were some fantastic insights from our presenters today, and I want to thank you for their time and effort. Much of what they said contains some really important insights when thinking about new institutional efforts such as new European Bauhaus, and I thank them for their contribution to that discussion today. I'm going to hand back to Ramia now to take us to the latter phases of our event today.
Ah, yes, the classic mute button. Thank you, Ben and contributors. My mind is blown and full of new ideas, further questions, and ready to discuss. We will have a brief break before our final round table hosted by Caroline Stevenson with fantastic guest speakers. But take a few minutes, take about 5 minutes to reflect on these 3 sessions. How have these perspectives challenged or changed your ideas or even your ideals? What kind of new prospects does this open up? Please share your thoughts via the chat or the social media, and we'll welcome you back in now 4 minutes for the final roundtable discussion. Welcome back from the break and welcome to the culminating session today, which is a roundtable discussion where we can kind of unfold some of these topics, but also bring in some new and external perspectives to the discussion today. So we'll have a final roundtable hosted by Professor Caroline Stevenson, who will introduce our three fascinating guests. Caroline, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Ramia. Hello, I'm Caroline Stevenson. I'm Head of Cultural and Historical Studies at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts London. And welcome to the concluding roundtable for today's event on Bauhaus. We're so delighted to have you here, and we hope that you've enjoyed the provocations so far. So in this event, we have a team of experts from different disciplines and cultural organisations across the UK and the Netherlands to share perspectives on the role of culture and the arts in defining a new Europe, and to continue the debate around the expertise and innovation we can bring as creative and critical practitioners, researchers and educators to the new European Bauhaus initiative. This is a short session. We'll be talking together for about 30 minutes, so we won't have to feel free to continue posting comments and responses as we go along. And if you're on social media, please use hashtag Bauhaus to share the discussions. So let me introduce you to our panel. Hicham Khalidi. Hicham is a curator and director at the Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands. Indy Johar, who is an architect and co-founder of Dark Matter Labs here in the UK. And Meg Baker, interim director of education for Students Organizing for Sustainability, again here in the UK. So I'm going to start by asking each of you to reflect briefly and from your area of expertise to the themes emerging from the new European Bauhaus and to the provocations of our Unbauhaus event. And I'd like to start with you.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to contributing. I think it's such a big question. I think when we talk about a new Bauhaus, I think it's really important to situate it into a structural transition, and a structural transition in our relationship with the world. Whereas the old Bauhaus, or the Bauhaus, the original Bauhaus, was a part of a theory of control, part of a theory of how we engage with the world through an extension of imposition of human need. I think we're into a different relationship with the world. And I think we must situate a new conversation about the Bauhaus in a much more fundamental transition, which is no longer about our relationship as in control of the world, but our relationship with the future in a much more didactic sense. Our relationship with the future, not about colonization and control, but being in respect of the risks that we generate for future generations. Our relationship with land, not being putting land into servitude to us, but actually being in treaty with our ecological systems around us. Our relationship with each other, not to instrumentalize other humanity to the needs of the few, but actually in a new form of didactic, which is all about unlocking the full capacity of all of humanity. Our relationship with material things, which may no longer be about ownership, but being around stewardship of our material economy in a much more circular sense, which I think challenges deep fundamental institutions which construct our relationship with the world, but the nature of the objects we make. And also recognizing that our material economy will have to be substantively reduced if we're going to deal with the nature of our transition. Material economy is an input-output economy generating huge amounts of waste. I think we're going to have to reduce our material economy, make it circular, make it long form, whilst we simultaneously grow our intangibles economy. So maybe the new Bauhaus is much more about intangibles than it is about the tangibles. And in that, there is a new theory of aesthetics, a new theory of social form, which is actually really critical to the nature of objects that we make and the world that we construct, but not necessarily in an age of ownership and an age of consumption, but in an age of being in treaty with. I don't know if that throws up a kind of a way of saying into this.
Yes, it does. And it leads us nicely on to our next panelist, Hicham, who has been quite critical of the term Bauhaus, first of all. Hicham, could you reflect briefly on today's event?
Thank you for the invitation as well. I'm speaking here from the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht in the Netherlands. The Jan van Eyck Academy is an international residency, and for the next 10 years, we have the ecological crisis in mind. How does the ecological crisis determine art practice in the next years to come? We wrote a letter last year objecting the term to New European Bauhaus, finding it to be non-inclusive, anthropocentric, patriarchal, and we wanted to go beyond that. And first, if anything that the Bauhaus could be, or the New European Bauhaus project could be, first of all, we needed to have a discussion about the term, because it leads to certain ideas of what, let's say, the modernist project has been. And for us, and that's why I connected it also to Professor Rolando Vázquez, who is a scholar in decoloniality, to be thinking about this connection between modernity and colonialism. So for us, it was really important to denounce or to give a critique on what this term could mean, without even discrediting the project of the Bauhaus itself, or lead into ideas of being against Europe, because we're not, but to instigate a discussion about what modernity meant for us and how it led to the crisis that we are in. So basically, you can read all of that in the article that I wrote with Rolando Vázquez, but in numerous lectures and conferences we did since then. Also in tandem with the European Commission, we've had a couple of discussions also with them about it, and they're really open and keen, not so much in changing the name, but definitely in having that discussion. And I assume that also the idea of adding inclusion to the pillars of beauty and sustainability is a good thing. We are super happy with it, but still, it would be great to have that discussion. Also, what this term exemplifies also in the structure that comes with it, and the idea of beauty and aesthetics in relation to sustainability. I think that sort of rounds it up, and maybe we can later on discuss what that means.
Thank you. Meg, we heard from a number of students today talking about their concerns around sustainability and the environment. Can you reflect a little bit on what today's event means for you?
Hi, Caroline. Thanks for having me here. I don't come at this from an area of expertise on Bauhaus, like potentially the other panelists may do, but more so in terms of speaking about student perspective and student demand and concern about the climate crisis, and how projects and initiatives like this need to be adopted and approached in a fully inclusive way, which definitely follows on from what the last two speakers spoke about. We know that students are concerned about the climate crisis. We've been carrying out surveys for the last 5-6 years, asking students how concerned they are about climate change. And in February or March this year, 90% of students who responded to the survey stated that they were concerned or very concerned about climate change. And so they, like, from other work that we've been doing, we've been identifying it like an ongoing and continuous trend that shows that students want to see their universities and their education institutions embedding sustainability into formal education. And so they want that to be done through their courses. So connected with that, as SOS UK, we were previously the National Union of Students Sustainability Team, and we still work very closely with NUS, and I guess connecting with the new European Bauhaus and what that's trying to do in like a kind of, it's a niche area in many ways. However, it sounds like an interdisciplinary approach is trying to be taken, and that deeply connects with our kind of vision for a holistic and an interdisciplinary approach to tackling sustainability challenges. And so I would fully support that in that respect. But in terms of our connection with NUS's campaign for the last year has been to decolonize education, and through our work in collaboration as SOS UK with the Universities and Colleges Union is to call for both decarbonising and decolonising to happen in synergy with one another. And so that the aim of that is using decolonising and decarbonising as processes for addressing climate injustice. I hope that makes sense. And then when you bring that down to the level of like Bauhaus, it's about identifying how we can use the decolonised approach to both decolonise and decarbonise, so that we take a fully, it's like a democratic approach where we're platforming voices that have maybe been cut out through the process of colonisation. And by decolonising, we're looking to ensure that we're creating an inclusive space where we're empowering people who have potentially for like years and years and years been actually demonstrating practices that are really positive for the planet, both like socially and environmentally. And so I would hope that the new European Bauhaus could adopt these kinds of processes and practices.
Thank you. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'd like to begin our discussion by asking each of you what role you think that the art school should take in the future framing of Europe. Here at the University of the Arts London, we are very firm in our belief that we should be an institution with a social purpose, that it should be a multidisciplinary, diverse, anti-racist and sustainable institution with a global and inclusive vision. And we've already acknowledged that that vision is at odds with the vision of the Bauhaus. But with that in mind, what role should the future of our art schools have in responding to the critical issues of our times? What position should they take within a broader cultural ecology? Hicham, could we start with you?
and maybe, and thank you, the previous speakers. I'm shocked to hear that 90%, or I'm actually very happy to hear that 90% sort of is concerned, and so that's in fact happy and concerned at the same time. So I think we should go back and see what is going on in art academies right now, and especially in the Netherlands. There is a huge sort of fight going on, or sort of a discrepancy between what the institute stands for and what students want to stand for. And as you can see, many academies, the idea of the artist or the idea of the student against the institutes being played out, and it being played out through all sort of political mechanisms and political events that we are seeing around more and more. And Black Lives Matter was the first one, and this can be sort of be manifested within whether institutes want to make or want to take certain positions or not. After that, the Corona crisis hit, and then the Palestinian situation. And the next thing might be the Zapatistas or whatever. But every time there's a new thing coming up that needs to be addressed, and schools, art schools and design schools are not prepared for that, not at all. So even though also because they, in the UK might have much more sort of an inclusivity framework that might work better than in the Netherlands, but still, we lack tools and instruments in order to cope with these mechanisms that are going on right now. And the first thing that is hugely important is the position that an institute should and can take in terms also trying to defend what the autonomy of the arts and science can and should be. In the Netherlands, there is this idea that arts and design, science should not be political, it should be apolitical, and that it should take a non-political stance. And this is at odds with what is being asked for by students. If you connect that to the idea of the climate emergency, none of these schools in the Netherlands have committed to speaking out the emergency, declaring the climate emergency. Because for many artists and for many art schools, and the traditional view of that is that we should refrain from being political. So I would start there. And we need to renegotiate the position of artists and designer students in relation to the institute. And then we can take it from there. If 90% is concerned, we need to take that seriously. I would start there.
Thank you. Meg, what are your thoughts?
It's a good question. I mean, the role of universities, art schools, they all have civic responsibilities. If somebody has been through higher education and they've achieved that certain level of like education, there's a kind of a civic responsibility that they carry with them on graduation. And so those institutions also need to uphold those responsibilities that their graduates will carry with them through the rest of their lives. Through our work with UCU and through our work as SOS UK, we encourage institutions to declare a climate emergency, just like the previous speaker just mentioned, and not just to declare a climate emergency, but make a clear and transparent public declaration of what their action is going to look like in respect to that and how they're going to report on progress against those action areas. So UCU have a campaign connected with COP26, which is launching next week, which is to decarbonize and decolonize for 2030, because we know that the 2050 net zero carbon targets are unrealistic in terms of the urgency that we're facing right now. And so through our work in connection with People and Planet and various other student-led organizations is calling for universities to work towards a net zero goal of 2030. And so the connection with Decolonize is also to recognize that we need to take a joined up approach to this and not just focus on the environmental impacts, but also the social impacts of this.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And Indy, what are your thoughts on the role of the arts?
Yeah, I mean, very much agree with what was being said. I would add some stuff. I think one of the biggest challenges I think we face is a colonization of our imagination. I think we're living in an age of the greatest deficit in imagination that's possible. And I think that's preserving the lock-in of the now and an instability and an inability to deal with the future. So often if we talk about visions of the city, I'm going to use it as an example, I think the visions of the city that are being portrayed are completely locked into 20-year-old theses of the city and how humans will live. And I think we've got a massive strategic lock-in of our imagination. And I think there's a great critical role to liberate us from a kind of linear Hollywood thesis of the future, which is increasingly sort of zombified in every sense. And I think that's a really key role, because I think there is that narrowing of imagination and the gift of imagination to only a few, and the controlling of the future through that lens, I think is really problematic. And I think it's underplayed and undervalued. So I think the role of artists as activists is great, but I think actually there's real critical role in challenging our imagination infrastructures, one dimension. Second, I think it's really critical that artists and schools of art actually disrupt the spaces and the deep coding institutions of our future. And what do I mean by that? I think physics, maths, all these places, science, health, are constructed through largely a kind of a colonization perspective, our land economy. And I think there is a deficit of imagination of the future. So if you talk about cities, everyone assumes the idea of ownership. Everyone assumes the idea of private economy. If you talk about financing, everyone assumes the idea of capital and the power of capital and the asymmetric power of capital. There are so many strategic sort of lock-ins, conceptual lock-ins, mimetic lock-ins at society. So your house is your castle. These mimetic lock-ins all need to be disrupted. And it's a critical role for artists to not only, I think, to play at three levels: the imagination landscape, the kind of what I would call the deep institutional landscape, and challenging them. So be artists, physicists, be artists, mathematicians, challenge those precepts, and then also working at the mimetic level of society, where there are deep code mimetics of how we perceive the world, which need structural disruption. So I think deep art needs to operate at those levels. And whilst it's great that we can do challenging graffiti on the streets and address the public realm, I don't think change is operating there. And I think we need to operate at that peripheral, the kind of structural layer of society. And I think artists the schools of art and artists in all their dimensions have a key role to play there, and disrupting exactly all those preconceptions, all the way from employment contracts, which are kind of contracts of servitude, which create very particular types of organization, to our perception of what society is and what cities are. So that's where I'd go.
Fantastic, brilliant. I'd like to return to the idea of beauty. I'd like to ask you, starting with Indy again, what kinds of opportunities, we've kind of identified the problematics around the idea of beauty, but what kind of opportunities arise from a focus on beauty, in relation to placemaking of the kind that's envisaged in the European Bauhaus?
So, I mean, I'm going to be very mechanical about this, but not to only by the reason that I don't want to prescribe beauty. I think this is something I'm very reluctant to do. I think it is evident that in our society we're going to be moving in two ways. One, the power of intangibles, i.e., non-tangible material value, will increase, and second, the power of long use materiality will also increase. Now, those two things, and then the third thing of a high velocity biomaterial economy will also increase. These fundamentals are going to transform how we create our environments and what our thesis of value, beauty, relationships are. And in that, I think a new aesthetic is going to be formed. And in that, I think there will be decentralized, personalized theses of beauty as opposed to centralized, monolithic ideas of beauty. I think we're operating in a decentralized, highly contextual notion of beauty, which is be both space and temporally beautiful and emergent in that context. But I think these fundamental economic shifts are going to construct a new aesthetic, and a parametric aesthetic, a space-time aesthetic, which will be particular to its notion and particular to its context. And being able to create these relational things, I think we'll have a new idea of aesthetic and thereby a new idea of beauty within it. I'm reluctant to define beauty because I think this is also a problematic black hole, I think. But I think in that is the emergence of a new beauty.
Amazing. Hicham, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, if you want me to say good things about it, right? I can completely go with Indy. I think this idea of new aesthetic, plurality, relationality, maybe it comes from the idea of subjectivity. Maybe the subjective will lead us into different forms and different ways of thinking, because beauty is a subjective thing. It's a plural thing, in fact. It's not a static thing. So in that sense, I think it's we can try to form ideas around that in this way, but beauty is also something that needs to be as it is now stated within those pillars of sustainability and inclusivity. We need to be very careful with that, because who is speaking, from which position are we speaking from, and who is allowed to speak, and so this is very important when one speaks about beauty, or when one speaks about the good life, or when one speaks about innovation, progression, etc., etc. So I think we need to really be careful with the words that we use, and we need to be specific as well. And the words that we use, we need to invent new terms, new ways of thinking, and we can only do that by working together on all different levels, from different backgrounds, from different angles. And this will require effort. And we should not be stating things right now. We should be doing that later. We should first come together and rethink everything that's been said right now. I mean, you get now a lot of things that are being said that I really agree with, and that I think are hugely important.
Thank you. And Meg, so much of your work is about coming together, and can you talk a little bit about how ideas around inclusivity really inform the work that you do and the people that you work with?
Yes, of course. So I just want to draw on the concept of education for sustainable development, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's all about promoting pedagogies in which students and staff work in partnership with one another, which I would say is really key to this, because it's about co-creating the idea of aesthetics and beauty, and it doesn't need to, it's about like recognizing different perspectives, taking a participatory approach so that people value different perspectives and different knowledge systems, and yeah, different values as well. And so through that collaborative approach to working and sharing learning and sharing practices and taking a kind of a critical approach to learning rather than learning in a way in which you're imparted with knowledge and expected to kind of just take that for granted or take that as it is, by promoting a teaching and learning approach in which students and learners as well as staff continuously grow through this process of participation, collaboration, and kind of critical thinking. It's a really positive way of kind of coming together to join forces in envisioning what a future could look like. For good and for bad, I suppose you could use this in many different forms, but with the concept of education for sustainable development, it's very much about how can we co-create a more positive future for everyone, like people and planet.
Would you like us to continue?
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah, great.
And just following on what at the moment about intergenerational people building equitable and also sustainable.
Happy to jump in on the intergenerational conflict.
Yeah, follow on
That'd be
from what she was saying.
Sorry, can you ask that question one more time, please?
So Meg, from saying,
I am, yeah, sorry, I didn't quite hear it properly. Wow, that's a massive question and a very good one. So yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And I think that it's more than fascinating. That's a really bad choice of words. So in terms of how we recognize and actually, I think respect that is really, really important. And I'm almost concerned about using the word respect in this context, because through this process that we're wanting to ensure that we're valuing different knowledge systems, bringing together students, staff, members of the community from different lived experiences so that we can co-create this more like collective future for sustainability and for addressing the crises that we're currently facing. We also have to acknowledge that people will have both their own current lived trauma related to these crises, as well as intergenerational trauma connected with that. And it's that there has to be a balance, and the way in which we explore this needs to be done in a really safe way, because we can't expect people who have lived experience or who have intergenerational trauma from lived experience, we can't expect them to become the spokespeople, but we need to create the space in which they are given a platform and feel safe to explore this together. And if the past experiences that they have are of feeling like they're excluded from these spaces, it needs to be done in a really careful way. I don't have a specific explanation of how that should be done, because I actually feel like, as a white person stood here saying this, it's not really fully appropriate for me to define what that should look like either. But I also don't think it's fair to expect people with lived experience of oppression to be the ones who are expected to find the solutions either, because it's actually, it's something that we need to do collectively, and we need to do it in a way in which everybody is given the space to listen to one another, learn from each other's experiences, and learn to work together in a more inclusive and safe way. But well-being needs to be at the forefront of that, and that's individual and societal and cultural well-being needs to be recognised through that process. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, like if any of the other speakers.
Sure. I was just thank you for that, Meg, and absolutely agree. The question also is maybe, what do we see as intergenerational? Are these the generations that are here now, and the communications between those generations, or the generations that are not here now? Do future generations have rights too? And I think that's important also to acknowledge. And how do we give them rights? And I like the idea of the Wales ambassador for future generations, who on a judicial set of values and determines the rights of future generations by looking at projects, even large project development and things like that, or what future generations will think and how they would act in the case of the people that are working on projects. So this is also ideas that have been posed by several people, and I think it's interesting to look at that as well. So I was just wondering whether was the idea of intergenerational also including generations that are not here yet.
I'd love to build on that. I don't know if the sound's working, but I think that's a really good extension of the question, right? Intergenerationality. But I think there's also a more fundamental question also on the table, which is intergenerationality exists with the idea that there is a generation and there is an individual in a way. It's structured on the extension of the thesis of the individual and the extension of that back up to some form of interdependence. And I think there is a really more fundamental question of how do we reconstruct ourselves to be human? If we understand our humanity, or being human, as a physical idea of ourselves, as it is an object idea, which is really a very 17th, 18th century notion of the human, I think that's an old idea of being human. And even with the science that's currently on the table, it's really interesting if you look at it either through a quantum level or you look at it through sort of a microbiome level. The thesis of being human and the object notions of entanglement and other forms are really much more advanced. So I would wonder, as sort of provocateurs, whether we need to more fundamentally challenge the thesis of our individuality. I think in quantum physics terms, right, everything exists in its full potentiality simultaneously, and only by giving attention does it materialize into a single point of measurability. Now, if that's true, we live in a completely different world to what we've been prescribing over the last 300 to 400 years. And I think we need to go deeper into that question to open up a different perspective of how we see and operate in the world. Space-time may be just a convenient classification order, not necessarily any form of truth in it. And then how do we operate into that space of imagination around that really becomes critical. So I suppose I would say yes, intergenerationally, but can we also expand the notion? Because I think there's a critical opportunity to do that. And I think that's going to be fundamental in being able to drive some of the change. Just to extend that.
table and say, what are the triumphs at the moment? What is our creative sector doing successfully? What are the things that we need to take forward and the things that we need to pay attention to? Meg, can we start with you?
Well, as a speaker on behalf of students, coming from Students Organising for Sustainability, I would be a really, really massive advocate for ensuring that any work that's done that is exploring transformation of how we're doing teaching and learning in our art schools would be to work with your students and reach beyond the walls of your campus and connect and collaborate with members of the community to ensure that the work that you're doing has greatest impact for both students and the community. So take a collaborative approach, work in partnership, and empower your students so that they are really confident to be empowered graduates when they move beyond their time in education.
Excellent. And Hicham?
Yeah, I can build on that. I mean, representation and how representation is going to be formed, I think is going to be essential. And I think what students and young people bring in on the table today is fantastic. And I'm super proud and hopeful because of that. So that would be mine.
Thank you. And Indy?
I would say the greatest thing we could take forward is our polymathic capabilities. I think artists are fundamentally polymaths, and I think this is the greatest deficit that we have in society, is the siloing all of our capabilities. And that siloing is fundamentally destroying our capability to see the world anew. And we're standing on thousands and thousands of micro legs of knowledge with no forms of integration. So for me, I think what artists and schools of art can bring together is a new school of polymathic capabilities. And I would encourage everyone to take that perspective, because I think that's going to be critical to build a new way to see the world and a new way to operate in it.
Okay. And are there any final closing remarks?
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that is a wonderful thought to close on. Thank you so much to Hicham Khalidi, Indy Johar, and Meg Baker for joining us today for our Unbauhaus roundtable. And I'd like to thank all of the contributors to today's event from across University of the Arts London, our students, early career researchers, professors who have generously shared their thoughts, their expertise on ideas around beauty, sustainability, and inclusivity, the three themes of the new European Bauhaus. I'd also like to thank the organisers for putting together such a wonderfully rich programme. Professors Lucy Kimball, Ramia Mazé, Susan Pugh-Sanlock, Ben Stopher, Mick Grierson, and the International Relations Unit here at University of the Arts London, and to our Professor and Vice-Chancellor, James Purnell. Please do continue to post responses to the Unbauhaus event on social media. Please use our hashtag Unbauhaus. Your thoughts and these debates will help frame our response to the new European Bauhaus initiative. And thank you all for being with us and sticking with us today. And we hope that you have found it a rewarding and rich experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your different perspectives and standpoints and bringing those to our table. This is the start. This event is the start, the first response of us here at UAL. And again, the Unbauhaus, the unpacking, the unfolding, the unraveling of these ideas, and also therefore being self-critical as an institution and engaging with dialogues with you and the different student and cultural sector and wider societal stakeholders in these questions. So thank you all, contributors, panelists, and all of you who have joined here in the audience today. Please reach out, continue the conversations. We look forward to forthcoming dialogues, potential extensions or new initiatives around these issues and our shared interests and commitments. Thank you on behalf of the organizing team, UAL, and all of us.